Let me first just say a few things about how we came to be here today, which is in 2015, I wrote this book, Virtual Memory, which in a way was a bit of a bait and switch. I did not actually write about VR in that book. I wrote about digital, time-based contemporary art and video, and whether the digital and the analog presented a significant difference from one another. And I wanted to trace the roots of the term virtual back to its philosophical kind of origins and think about whether that still applied today in a world where we associate the virtual with simulation, computers, even the false. And so I ended up talking to Shari, who agreed to do an interview with me very kindly, and we talked about the work that she's done with New Frontier at Sundance. And so just to kind of kick us off, I guess, Shari, as we heard, you've had this illustrious career as a programmer and curator, going over to Sundance in 2007, taking over the New Frontier section, and then introducing VR programming into that section, which had previously been experimental film in 2012 first, and then more and more in recent years. So could you tell us what brought you to that place to include this work?
My history is actually sweatier than the way that Homay put it forth, because it was a very organic thing. I started at Sundance in '98, coming from experimental film. I did a festival called Mix, if you know it. And they gave me the Frontier section because I came from experimental film. And I was, of course, interested in mixing up the formula that they had. They were showing only feature films. I got rid of the time limit. But I was always interested in kind of overlaying disciplines, film, art, and even since 1994, digital technology and kind of like expression, cinematic expression through digital technology. So New Frontier, we re-inaugurated, that was the Frontier section, we re-inaugurated in 2007. And I just started bringing people from the art world, people from film who was interested in experimentation, and digital creative technologists. And bringing work in a showcase that was socially oriented, that really had to do with the cinematic image and cinema culture. A show that came from all these different disciplines that would actually be legible in a film environment. So as I was tracking artists for this show, I came across a journalist. Her name is Nani de la Peña, and I came across her like 2009, a couple of years after I started New Frontier, and she was doing some work in Second Life. She was making documentaries in Second Life. That Gone Gitmo is one where she talked about Guantanamo Bay in Second Life, and she would show documentaries on the walls of this virtual world that you could navigate on computer. I don't know how many people know Second Life. Looks like a lot of people do. And so that's how she kind of crossed my radar. And she said, "Shari, you got to come to my studio." And this was 2011. It's like, okay, let's go. She went. It was like this. In Mar Vista, USC, DOD studio. It was where she was situated. And she put this giant helmet on me with big, positional tracker tree. The room was full of sensors. I had a giant backpack with 3 people following me around, and I experienced virtual reality for the first time. This was 2011. Virtual reality has been around for a while, but this was the first time I had ever experienced it. And it was a revelation. It was way different than I knew about it, because I was walking around in an environment. So it blew my mind. The piece was called Hunger in Los Angeles, and it was made of her eyewitness audio accounts of a hunger line in Los Angeles. She was very interested in telling a story about hunger, and she chose to do it this way. And it blew me away, and because if I had read this story, I would have thought, oh, wow, that happened. If I'd seen it, I would have been like, wow, that's really sad. But I had experienced it, so I actually remember it as something that happened to me. And so I talked to Nani. He was like, wow, this is amazing, but how are you going to fulfill your duty as a journalist? which is to educate the voting public. And she said, I don't know, but I know that this is the way that I want to report the news, because this is the way that's going to really explain, what I'm trying to convey. So, and she had such passion. I brought her to New Frontier, and that was the 2012 edition. And that was how that's how I got involved with VR, really kind of chasing Nani, and Nani bringing, and she had a 17-year-old intern named Palmer Lucky at the time. This is the story. So I was like, yes, let's do it. And so she went to USC. She was like, all right, let's do it. And so she was working with a $50,000 headset that was evolved over the 90s, and they were doing that technology, and they were like, you're not going to take our $50,000 headset to Sundance. So she worked with Palmer to create what was essentially, they showed up at Sundance with this headset that was like duct taped together. It was like, some like maybe cell phone inside of there, and that was essentially the prototype for the Oculus Rift. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of how I intersect with VR, and I watched it happen. I watched it affect the audiences there, and saw it so powerful. The effect was so powerful, and watch Oculus come out of this in this amazing way. So I hung in there with it. I felt a responsibility to continue to not only nurture but also take responsibility for this medium that was so clearly powerful, kind of a powerful convergence and effect on
Great.
audiences.
So I'm already going to deviate a little bit from the outline we discussed earlier, because this is sparking thoughts for me. First of all, it's just fascinating that it was a journalist that introduced you to this work first, or through which you were introduced to this work. And I'm thinking of the most recent piece that De La Peña did, Kia, which was on the list. It's fascinating. I showed that to students in one of my classes at Bryn Mawr, and one of the students said, oh, it's so interesting. It eliminates the problem of the male gaze, because there's no single encoded camera point of view there. And that was a kind of a way to put that hadn't quite occurred to me before. But the other feature of that work, Kia, is that it's a computer-generated reenactment of a 911 phone call in a case of domestic violence. So generically, we're in the realm of documentary reenactment, but using original archival audio. And yet when you look at it, there's a kind of layer of, I don't know if I want to call it buffer or something else, because they're computer-generated characters. And then in addition to that, you have the ability to look or not look, or turn and look for the police car coming, or look at the person who's on the phone. I'm wondering if you have further thoughts about that and how that connects to her earlier piece, Hunger in Los Angeles.
Yeah, you're reminding me of when I first splashed into Hunger in Los Angeles. And it was, she was using Unity. At the time, it was like, this was 2011, early Unity. By film standards, it just looks like bad animation, and the people look like really uncanny valley, like curved teeth and stuff like that. And I was one of those people, but it didn't take more than about a minute before I became a denizen of the uncanny valley. And it was just my world. I kind of accepted it as my norm, So the things that were interesting were maybe trumped a kind of judgmental gaze that I had on the aesthetics, the interaction that I had with people, because it was interactive, and the authenticity of the audio recordings, and just the situation, was so powerful that it became inconsequential that that the characters were fictional, because I was a fictional character in it too. So it just became normal for me, and the story. And not only normal, but it was not only my image, but my environment. It was my world. I was inside of it. So it just went away.
Yeah.
How many people saw it? Did people see Kia?
Kia. Yeah, it's on the New York Times VR, and it's very easy to access. So you've just mentioned something that we could talk about now, which is VR that has an interactive component to it, which is not true of, say, things that you're going to view with a Google Cardboard, but which I recently experienced for the first time in this installation by a young artist named Florian Meisenberg, who essentially created a kind of imaginary museum using the HTC Vive, which is a fully immersive with a kind of a simulcast video, and it has haptic controllers and components. So you can actually manipulate objects in the environment, and there's a kind of vibrational feedback that you get haptically. What I haven't done yet is what you describe with, is it called Life of Us?
Life of Us.
Yeah, where there are 4 people in the installation together. Could you say more about that?
Yes, just for folks who don't know the difference between 360 and positional tracked VR. So most of the stuff that you saw there, it was more 360, a lot of stuff that's on the list. And the 360 is that if me and my finger is in the same environment, when I move, the finger moves. But in a positionally tracked VR, if I move toward the finger, I go closer to the finger, and it deepens the buy-in. So with this VR, Life of Us, it's made for the Vive, which is a positionally tracked headset, one of the better ones, room scale. So you're moving around in an entire room, and it's social. So it is a 7-minute experience of the evolution of life on Earth. You start, and you inhabit the character. So you start as an amoeba, you get into a tadpole, and you go. And you start to crawl and land, and then you turn into a raptor, and you go all the way to becoming a robot at a disco party with all the other earlier manifestations of yours. So that's your experience, but you do it with another person. So we're both in Vives, and we're looking at each other, going through this evolution, and we could talk to each other as well. So you can actually meet somebody inside of VR, which is just a tremendous feeling, because you're in this sort of awe-inspired environment, and you're talking, and the voice is mutated, so it's part of the playfulness of it, and you're interacting, like I'm pulling monkeys off of the next person, and it's like a joy-making machine, but it's also like a Disney ride as well. It's very accessible, all animated. Yeah. It was called Life of Us by Chris Milk and Aaron Koblin.
Well, and so that actually leads nicely into another Chris Milk film that you had us view, Evolution of Verse. So this film, I'll describe it for you briefly. It's our film. This VR is. It starts off, and you're on this kind of placid lake setting, and you can turn. It's 360, and then slowly you see a train coming in the distance, and at a certain point it turns and begins to come across the lake straight towards you, and I personally jolted a little bit when I saw it coming forward. Of course, this is a reference to the Lumiere brothers' Arrival at a Train at a Station, which some say is the first documentary ever made. It's often credited, and there's this mythological story that Tom Gunning writes about of the audience members fleeing, these credulous spectators believing the image to be real, fleeing the theater at the sight of this, photorealistic train coming towards them. Probably an apocryphal story, but it's very telling about the way that we relate to images as if they were live perceptions. But in addition, the film then goes, there's a kind of ribbon sequence and then a kind of roller coaster sequence, and we end up in this almost, it's like the end of 2001, A Space Odyssey, and there's a kind of infant floating in this kind of void. And that film to me is so interesting in part because it harks back and encapsulates a lot of the pleasures of cinema from the turn of the 20th century, at the dawn of the medium. We have this reference to Lumiere and documentary. We have this reference to the cinema of attractions and trick films that are meant to give you a kind of roller coaster, almost physical sense of vertigo and the pleasure of that feeling, inducing these bodily sensations. And then finally we have sci-fi and fantasy, which is Méliès, in that sort of triumvirate of Lumiere, Edison, and Méliès. All three of them are in this piece. Anyway, so that's a reading of that piece. But I'm wondering if we could use that as a segue to think about what are the genres of VR that artists are exploring.
Wow, that's in terms of the storytelling space.
Yeah, is it, I mean, we have documentary, we have fantasy, we have almost allegory in the case of Life of Us.
I mean, it's as various as you find in film. You know, ranging from, there's a lot of horror. It's told really effective in VR because, you know, horror threatens the space that you live in, and VR can really literally come from behind you and really scare the shit out of you. To, you know, documentary, which is super interesting because you're often like one of the subjects of the documentary. So you have a different kind of, a very unique relationship to the subject and subjectivity of the documentary. To, you know, there's, you know, performance artists that take on the medium, that tell stories in really unique ways, like Oscar Raby did a piece about his father who witnessed a terrible slaughter during Pinochet, and he populated the VR. You were him, and the people in the VR were himself as well. And he's trying to come closer to his father, and there's a performative element to it. You know, Rose Trochet brings her like very kind of indie cinema style to the space, and sometimes not opening up the gaze all the way to 360, but really using the 270 or the 180, which is a kind of naturally evolved gaze that we have from cinema and from just survival and wanting to see what's coming at us, and the fact that our eyes are in front of our heads. To, you know, musicians that are creating a very brand new language for this thing, like you know, Reggie Watts, who is just like this fantastic imaginary and thinks about story in terms of music. So it really, his work is really, for me, you know, more than a lot of the work that I see, gets to the real possibilities of VR that goes beyond the cinematic and, you know, achieving some of the wondrous things that cinema does. But he's really more going down, he's using the medium to go down a rabbit hole of a kind of sensorial journey that involves sound and visual and how you're moving through the space.
So let's go through some of these documentary, journalism, horror. Horror, I'm actually thinking, so some of you may have read about a piece that's in the Whitney Biennial by, his name is Jordan Wolfson, called Real Violence. It's been getting a lot of buzz. It's a VR piece that involves a beating, witnessing a beating, and it's actually a mannequin with some post-production effects on it. But it's startling, and I found it very odd and strange to have that be the only VR piece in the show, because it made it seem like that's what VR is for. It's just very viscerally violent. There's a kind of trigger warning before you agree to view the piece, and a lot of what you see when people are in their headsets are actually people turning their heads away. So, I mean, to me, that it is in a way that's a horror piece.
It's probably the most horrific thing that I've experienced in VR up to now, and it's the way that it's constructed is actually quite conceptual, which I can understand why it's in the Whitney, and informed by an art practice, because he starts. You may have experienced this in your, you know, looking at some live action. Sometimes it can make you a little nauseous or really dizzy or kind of disoriented in your actual place where you're standing. So this piece starts kind of upside down. It like really ruptures you, right? Like, and so by the time and they have you holding on to a rail in this experience, so you don't fall apart. Because I would have fallen down if I hadn't been holding onto the rail, and then it gets you into this orientation of what you described of it was the artist taking a baseball bat and brutally beating this guy. And it's photoreal, it feels very real, and it's on the street of New York. It's just a New York street on a curb, and there's cars in the street, and no one's stopping, and no one's noticing, and he's just aggressively pummeling this guy, and
And you hear a prayer being sung in
that's
Hebrew.
right. There's that.
Yeah,
I didn't
as the
understand.
soundtrack.
Yeah, like Hanukkah prayer, some Jewish prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I can see how that piece works almost in a walkthrough of the whole biennial and looking at some of the other themes and content. I mean, I can sort of see why it's there, but it's just, to me, it's a little unfortunate that that will be a lot of people's first experience with a really high definition VR.
Yeah, it was on the CV1, one of the best headsets that are out there right now. And it certainly will communicate how visceral and how effective this medium is to making you feel not only present, but immediately violated,
Yeah.
like you're in danger. This guy could actually come around and swing this thing on you, or implicated. Like and this is one of the things that I find, fascinating about VR in general, and what I found interesting in this piece, seeing this piece, is that I had to actually watch myself respond to this piece at close range. It wasn't separated from me. I was actually in the space, and it was really disturbing. Like when I chose to continue on, when I chose to look away, it meant something about, it was telling me something about who I am and how I am,
Yeah.
in the world, and it was very hard to face.
And there's a huge value to that, in a way. I mean, I went like this, as I would if I were at a horror film, but
you
of
had the
course
VR.
that doesn't block it. You have to turn,
comes
you
closer,
have to
yeah.
actually turn or close your eyes. But what you just said now about how it implicates us, and it makes us aware and more cognizant and mindful of our own ethical implication in the situation that we're witnessing, because it feels so visceral and because it feels as if we are potentially bodily either at risk or in a position to intervene or what have you. That point I find really salient, and it's something that I think applies also to some of the more journalistic documentary pieces by Gabo Aurora, for example. When I watched, Waves of Grace, which is a documentary piece that is in an area where the Ebola virus is, there's an epidemic. And our sort of main character in the piece is a woman who had survived Ebola, so she has immunity, which means she can work as a caregiver to some of those that are stricken with it. And we follow her through, and we're in these spaces where we truly feel in the middle of it, not observing from a safe distance, not looking down. That masterful gaze genuinely feels slightly undone by the fact that we're in a 360-degree space. It feels like one is in the middle of it, and that's a situation where one would be at risk. And so it's just...
That's interesting, the term masterful gaze. That's the first time I've heard that. There's such an investment in that, like when you think about...
It's a little old school.
but you go to Toronto and you can go to the section called Masters. I mean, that is a very entrenched codification that comes from cinema.
Yes.
Maybe more so than anything.
Absolutely.
To
see is to possess, to control, to be superior to.
The auteur, it's a mastery is something that's very valued. And VR really breaks that down. You are not the master inside of a VR experience. You are an explorer. You're like a discoverer.
And neither is the creator, because they don't get to choose.
That's right.
The framing or the angle.
And then there's something, because a lot of people talk about VR as there's something that brings a childlike out of you, and it's got to be due to this, you know, that you just lose all claim to mastery inside of these experiences, and
Yeah.
you know, and you discover things that you're not really discovering, you know, like history of, I don't know, which ones have you seen? The Click Effect, Cardboard, Kia, Evolution Verse, Waves of Grace. I mean, these are all bison herd. You know about buffalo. It's not like you discovered buffalo for the first time when you saw a bison herd, but you did discover what it feels like to be next to
Right.
a moist buffalo, and maybe even like smell it. There's a discovery element to it that makes you feel like you didn't know anything, even though it's something that you've seen on TV many, many times.
And just to re-emphasize the point about the difference with the VR, compare and contrast that to Planet Earth or a more traditional style of nature documentary where I think there's still the sense of wonder, there's still intense proximity to the animals, but because you're sitting in your chair here and you're getting these wonderful sweeping vistas that are there, it feels very different than being in the middle of a herd of these large animals and become one of them in a way.
And kind of coming back to what you said before about virtual, you know.
Yeah.
Because, you know, stories are a little bit of like the code of this machine. You know, it determines what's real and what's not, these stories. And the stories are as good as the architecture that it gets communicated through. So, you know, stories in books and photographs and movies, that mastery, that masterful, the domain of mastery is always there, because you can always put the book down. You know, you can always close your eyes in VR, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Whether people choose to do that unless they're sick. If you sign up for it, you're signing up for like completely letting that go. So what does that mean in terms of how stories will then now come to construct the real? Because there's the shifting of the domain of mastery may shift what reality is, how stories make our reality. That's a very interesting question.
I mean, there's something that you said the first time we had this conversation, which is that you said subjectivity itself is being reorganized. Or I guess I said that, but I was paraphrasing something that you said. I was paraphrasing things that you said reality is being reconstructed. And I said subjectivity itself is being reorganized. But something on the level of how the invention of photography and the invention of the snapshot and the portable photographic camera, the invention of cinema, the invention of the portable cinema camera, like all of these things create shifts in our perception of the world, in our sense of what we have access to, and in a way, our political consciousness. And I know we're just barely on the cusp of it with this particular medium, but do you have thoughts about directions it could go, good and bad?
Wow. I mean, it really is the dawn of a brand new way of representation and communication. And
Do you think it's on par with the invention of cinema? Or is that going too far?
it's there. It's like the printing press.
Okay.
A little bit.
Okay.
You
Yeah, I
know,
mean, that
like-
was a big one.
Which was a big one.
Yeah.
And cinema did too. It reorganized society. You know, I think this medium has the power to do that. It's not there yet because of the points of access. It's just way too expensive now. And you know, Google Cardboard is sort of like the gateway to VR.
Yeah.
It's not the greatest, but it's there. You know, you have it. But you know, as I'm watching this field evolve, it leaps, quantum leaps. It takes a quantum leap every 3 months. So, you know, the technology is always getting better. You know, artists are taking it on in different ways, and it's not just art; it's medicine. You know,
Yeah.
medicine is 25% of the VR industry, which is super interesting for me because it's like, okay, well, how does medicine and storytelling overlap? You know, how much of medicine is storytelling, and that affects not only medicine but like really just a basic understanding of ourselves and our anatomy and our physiology.
Yeah. And what it is to be a vital living creature.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. And that actually reminds me of one of the pieces I wanted to talk about with you, which I only just saw recently, Notes on Blindness. Not a medical application of VR, but a kind of VR adaptation of the journals and audio recordings of a man named John Hull, who kind of kept a diary of his experience of losing his vision. And so using his audio recordings in which he talks about different aspects of that and certain ways in which the world shut down for him, or he would find himself in a state of panic, and then other ways in which the world actually opened up for him, and just how he would come to love it when it rains because it created a whole sort of topography around him where he could hear things near and far. And in the VR, Notes on Blindness, you enter that world and you sort of turn, and as you turn over here, you'll hear it's binaural audio, and so you'll hear something and then you'll turn, and you'll hear a slightly different pattern of raindrops, and then a kind of loose outline of an object will come into vision, mirroring that process of him hearing where things were, or in a way almost seeing through audio.
Yeah.
And that piece to me, it's fascinating because the visuals are extremely sparse, but it makes use of really good directional audio and with cues that are tuned to you moving your head. And I thought that was such an innovative way to use that medium.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that piece really, over time, this man found a way to see through his ears.
Yeah.
Over necessity and hardship, years. And in one VR piece, you're able to understand what it's like to see through your ears.
Yeah.
And through this new convergence of a language that speaks not only to your eyes, but to your ears, and also to where your body is actually at.
Yeah, exactly. Your proprioceptive self is
The
included.
proprioception, yep.
And you could use it as a way to train people to live with that disability or to train their other senses in a way. It's not, the piece isn't billed that way. It's a memoir, but I could see an application for that.
Yeah, essentially it's a shortcut to learn how to,
see with
to
your
see in
ears.
sonic holograms.
Yeah, yeah.
And and that's that really points to this quality of of this medium as it stands right now, just in terms of just the density of information that it can communicate.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I like the idea that an application, say a medical application, would come out of a storytelling artistry instead of vice versa.
Well, I showed a short documentary in this year's festival because I wanted to root the show in this other thing that's happening with VR, like really point to this medium that goes beyond entertainment. And it was a documentary about I guess it was Duke University, some researchers down in Brazil, and they were working with paraplegics.
I saw this one.
You saw this?
Yeah.
And they created this exoskeleton, this giant machine that they put the paraplegics in, and then they put a VR on the person, so that through the VR they could control the exoskeleton. But an unexpected thing happened. After about a month of the training, the paraplegics started to move their legs again, and they weren't walking. But before they were completely dead, and every single person who went through this training was then afterwards not qualified as paraplegics anymore. They gained some control over their legs, and so this is a profound
And sensation. Yeah. I mean I did see that, and it's miraculous. It's like genuinely miraculous that the mind neurons body connection could literally be rewired by images coordinated with certain kinds of movements in this immersive. I mean, it's quite stunning. I'm also thinking about like the sort of dystopic potentials of that, where it's like, oh, we'll use this to train soldiers to not feel anything. You know, there are ways
Well,
you can rewire. Yeah.
It speaks to the the mental plasticity that we all have, and
Yeah.
and it hasn't been touched only by VR. I mean, games. You know,
True.
the games have already been used by military to train.
Absolutely.
Military
And recruit.
and
even.
recruit, and but then there's like there's an assumption that this could also happen with VR, but keep in mind this mastery thing, which I really
Yeah.
love that you brought this up, because where things can maybe go wrong or go awry is building what you learn and packaging it with your sense of mastery and how you then choose to, as opposed to learning something in VR where you have no sense of mastery. You have an enormous amount of vulnerability and learning these things. And is that a bad thing, or is that a scary thing, or is that actually maybe a thing that turns the tide, or is it an empowering thing in terms of like rearming ourselves with our own humanity?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's related to something else you said earlier, which is in certain. I think we were just talking about VR in general, and you said there's a moment where you observe yourself being scared and see how you're scared. That sort of pause and experience where a part of you knows that this is not real life, which gives you a little cushion of space to be mindful, have an awareness, and observe your own, in some cases, nearly reflexive reactions. And then, of course, I wanted to connect that to, there's a whole genre of like meditation, guided meditation relaxation, which,
There's that. Yeah.
VRs. There's some
That's
of
a
them on the New
genre
York
right now.
Times site.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But just this idea that it's somehow, it's helping retrain your minds in some way.
Yeah, training mind and body
Yeah.
in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There was a quotation, or I guess it's kind of a story I wanted to share with you. So in my book, Virtual Memory, in my introduction, as many academics do, I decided to go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up one of the key terms in my study. So the word virtual reality enters the lexicon in 1987. And it's in an essay that's published in the Whole Earth Review, which is a kind of spin-off of the Whole Earth catalog, Stuart Brand. It's an essay published by, the title of the essay is Virtual Reality. And it's written by a guy named Yakov Garb, who was a UC Berkeley doctoral student in mathematics at the time, but who had a passing interest in computing. And he in the essay is actually a kind of Roland Barthes style critique of advertisements for computers. And he says, look, it's all these sort of like godlike figures whisking numbers about through gridded spaces, and it's an image of the computer as control, and the slogans will be stuff like, the power of the world at your fingertips. It's all about being the grand wizard, and somehow the computer is the thing that allows us to become that master puppeteer of the world. And so he critiques those, and he critiques interfaces and end-user operating systems in general, and says they contribute to a kind of fantasy about computers that they allow us to be omnipotent. And that's a fantasy that occludes the material realities of how the hardware is made, where the energy is coming from, everything else that's going on. In other words, he thinks it's a dangerous fantasy. And so it's very interesting to me that that's the first use of the term virtual reality. Virtual reality is a masking over of reality. However, if you go back to 1398, which is when the word virtual first appears in English, you get an almost opposite meaning. It means possessed of certain physical virtues or capacities, effective in respect of inherent natural qualities or powers.
That's interesting.
Yeah, capable of exerting influence by means of potentials. And so that was the meaning that I wanted to kind of recover.
Right. Yeah. that's
And
interesting,
see,
yeah.
are there works of contemporary digital art, video, etc., that are doing this, not that.
Well, you know, they both terms are implicating values, right? And
Yeah.
like the values that you
That's true.
extol or that you bring to the technology. And you know, I have a hard time thinking that a technology is bad or good on its own.
Yeah.
You have to actually use the technology, and your values will determine how you use it.
Yeah, I agree.
And the the second one, the one in the 80s, you know, very much describes our relationship to our cell phones. How we use the cell phone to master our world, to you know, magnify our presence, and chat with one another. But we're always the top. Very rarely the bottom in that relationship with this, you know, with the cell phone. You know, it's a
The cell phone never masters us or overcomes us or
the
makes
sheer.
us question our, yeah.
I mean, the volume, of course, can be overwhelming, but it's never resolved as, oh well, I'm just gonna, you know, throw the towel and say I lost. No, it's always, you know, it's always a fight to stay on top of things and to stay the master of it. Where, you know, in the end, you know, technology is just, I think, that technology is an extension of humanity. You know, technology has formed how our minds and our bodies have evolved ever since there was technology. You know, the arrow helped us, you know, kill animals and fire. You know, we were able to cook
Remotely.
it, and our brains started to get better and denser. And it's a feedback loop, the technology and the animus. And you know, it's a continuum. I think we get into trouble when we think that technology is separate from us, because that really affects the kinds of choices and our sense of it's sort of like a rupture of our identity almost, where we use the technology for something that's outside of us, as opposed to the value system of it is actually a part. It's my third arm, or it's actually my left hand, and would I endanger my left hand? Like what situations would I put my left hand in? You know, if you really truly had that kind of visceral relationship to the technology, you start to use it in a different way. You employ it in a different way, and it becomes an agent of your vulnerability and presence, and you get a different design. It's all about values and design, you know, and that the first one the first definition, you know, talks about the virtues.
Yes.
You know, and you know, what comes out of a living being that's not just, that doesn't have spirit.
Yeah,
It's something that comes
a
out
potential or a capacity, which in this one too, it's neutral. That could be a capacity for good or evil. The point is, it's a capacity or a potential.
of it. Right.
So, how are we on time?
About 10 minutes before we open.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Let me see if I missed anything in my notes. So here's, okay, this is a bit less heady, but so I have started looking at, ever since I put the New York Times VR app on my phone, I have started just barely accessing news stories on it. And I find that quite often the 360 aspect is kind of an afterthought or a gimmick. It hasn't been fully made integral to whatever story they're trying to tell. I just saw one, I think it was this morning actually, that was so the Met Gala was yesterday at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they did, this year the theme was a big show of Ray Kawakubo's work for Comme des Garçons. And it was a 360 camera in a museum setting. And in that case, I felt, okay, this is actually an appropriate use of VR news, because you are looking at these three-dimensional sculptural objects, and you want to see where they are in the room, not just a still after a still after a still as you would get in a slideshow or something. You're getting to experience a bit of the installation
Right.
as not just illustrations that have frames around them.
Right.
I'm wondering if you've had any experience with VR news stories, I guess, and what are some of the good and effective uses?
This conversation, I just came back from the Tribeca Film Festival, where they have a really great section called Storyscapes and a VR arcade now. It's had some really great work. But one of the things I noticed is that there is a pull that I think VR, those creators are from cinema to pretty much tell the story with what's in front of you. They'll turn your body, but oftentimes, because I'm one that always tries to hack the VR space and like looking behind me all the time. And oftentimes in these stories, I look behind me and there's nothing there.
Yeah.
It really
There's
is, the
just
story
blank.
is really happening in front of me.
Yeah.
And so I think you're getting a little lazy. or there's more to it than, like the Notes on Blindness is a great example. Or the Bison Herd it's these moments of presence where if there's a moist nose in front of you, you feel the moist nose. When you turn around, you see the meadow behind you. As opposed to, I mean, just thinking about some of the documentary. Well, certainly, maybe it's best to talk about maybe things that you've seen that were on the list, like the Click Effect, is kind of a great piece of documentary in VR because it resonates so powerfully with the subject. The subject being how dolphins and whales communicate to each other in sonic holograms. So they send these clicks, and they don't hear from the ears. They get an entire hologram, sonic hologram, in this gel underneath their chins, and then they can see from 360 degrees what that is, what the communication is. And it would be really hard to explain that and know what it feels like in a flatty. But in VR, that's what they're called these days, is they're flatties. But in VR, the notion that a communication can explain to you what it feels like back behind you and in front of you, it takes the opportunity for documentary storytelling to the next level.
Yeah. Well, and stereoscopy is a huge portion of that. We haven't mentioned that aspect. That we've mentioned the 360 and the immersiveness and the social interactive component. But I think stereoscopy, that's been tried. People have tried to do that with 3D film, but this is somehow different. And it's reminding me, again, going back to early days of photography, where you had these stereoscopic viewers of, exotic lands or, cities, or even like, images from the Civil War, battlefields, and people would view them on, these sort of wooden little stereoscopic, you had these sort of cards with 2 images in it.
There's an interesting documentary that I saw. It was Gabo's, his new piece called The Last Goodbye. And I'm going to forget the subject's name, but he was a Holocaust survivor. And what was interesting about this piece is that he seamlessly mixed 360 and positional tracking. So what that means to say is the first part of the documentary was with 360, he captured video of this guy in the same room. So you're just like sitting right next to this guy when he's telling you, I don't want to do this. This is going to send me down another realm of nightmares. And I'm an 80-year-old man, and I'm old, and I don't want to do this. And then you cut to the positional tracking, which is photoreal. So he captured this fellow with volumetric capture, which is basically video of the subject that is taken 360, so you can place them in the 360 environment and still see around him. And use photogrammetry, which is basically capturing photographically the gas chambers and this concentration camp, and then put him inside of it. So that real close, immediate feel that you got in the 360, where it was real, when you got into this animated situation where it felt actually photoreal, it was really powerful, you know, and he did it in such a way, like, you know how I move around and your eyes are tracking me? This is the first time I'd seen this technology in a documentary where this guy was photogrammatically, he was captured volumetrically, but his eyes would follow me. So it maintained
Oh,
a personal
wow.
connection. It was very chilling,
So
really
intense.
powerful. It was very intense, yeah. And that was, you know, I've seen a million Holocaust stories, but nothing like this.